Even as Ronald Reagan was getting to know Mikhail Gorbachev, even as he was warming up to Gorbachev, getting to like Gorbachev and getting to trust Gorbachev in negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, even as Reagan was trying to make things better between the United States and the Soviet Union, Reagan was not above putting pressure on Gorbachev, on the Soviet Union, reminding the world that there was a fundamental difference between what Reagan saw the United States stood for, freedom, democracy, individual opportunity, and what he believed the Soviet system, the communism, stood for, repression, the inability of people to have what they want. And so Reagan gave a very highly noted speech at the Berlin Wall in Berlin. The Berlin Wall had come to represent the division between East and West. It was a wall that was built across the city of Berlin in 1961. And the city was divided, but it had its East and West zones. And the wall was a concrete, literally, representation of this. And Reagan went to the wall to give a speech. And at the wall, he figuratively turned to the east. He turned toward Moscow, where Gorbachev was. And he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, if you are serious about better relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, better relations between East and West, Mr. Gorbachev, come to Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Reagan's speech got great press. It thrilled Reagan fans. This is our guy. This is our Ronald Reagan who is standing up to the Soviet Union. At the time, however, the wall speech seemed to be just an act of political theater. Gorbachev just brushed it off. This is what Reagan does. Reagan, even as he's negotiating, he has to give these speeches. He has to please the conservatives, the imperialists back home. And Gorbachev pretty much ignored the idea. The wall, to the extent that they said anything about it, he said the wall is the issue of the East German government, and it's up to the Germans to do something about it. But the division between East and West wasn't going to end. At least it wasn't going to end anytime soon. So Reagan gave this speech, and 2 years later, not quite 2 years later, he leaves office at the beginning of 1989, and the wall is still standing. So it appeared that Reagan's speech was indeed a matter of politics, a matter of diplomatic theatrics. Tear down this wall, great soundbite, but produces nothing. Well, whether Reagan's speech produced much or not, it remains an open question. But things were going on, and what was going on were the consequences of Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union. Because as part of the reforms that were taking place in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev allowed reforms to take place in the Soviet allies of Eastern Europe. Now, this had been forbidden by previous Soviet regimes, who insisted on keeping the screws tightly in control of the communist regimes of the Eastern European countries, for fear that they would somehow slide toward the West. But under Gorbachev, first of all, there was a recognition that under the Gorbachev reform program, the Soviet Union was not about to send bunches of troops into Hungary, as had happened in the 1950s, or Czechoslovakia, as had happened in the 1960s. No, the Soviet Union was cutting back on military spending, and it didn't want to be responsible for what was going on in these other countries. Gorbachev had issues of his own at home. And so there developed this policy, and it was unstated at first, that just as the Soviet Union was trying out reforms, so the governments of the Eastern European communist countries, the allies, some called them the satellites of the Soviet Union, could try their own reforms. And in fact, the question was put to one of Gorbachev's lieutenants, and I said, well, what's going on here? And he said, well, it's our version of what we call the Sinatra Doctrine. Now, it was a play on the American doctrines, the Monroe Doctrine, and I mentioned the Carter Doctrine a little while ago. the Sinatra Doctrine, named after Frank Sinatra, whose signature song was My Way. And the punchline of the song was, I did it my way. And what the Soviet leader was saying is, in fact, he articulated, he said, we're letting them do it their way so they can try their reforms. And various reforms took hold in the Eastern European countries. And what happened there was similar to what was happening in the Soviet Union. What Gorbachev belatedly discovered, now he knew the risk of this before he went in, but it only became apparent that once you take the lid off the jar, things start coming out and you probably can't get them, or you can't get the genie back in the bottle. So it's easier to open up reforms than it is to tighten back down. And once people in the Soviet Union started realizing they could complain, they could point out where these things were going wrong and that changes were possible, then they wanted more and more. So the reform program in the Soviet Union developed a momentum of its own that Gorbachev really had to work hard to stay in front of. He couldn't control it anymore. Still less could he control what was going on in the Eastern European countries. And this announcement of the so-called Sinatra Doctrine basically gave the signal to these Eastern European countries, go ahead, do your reforms, and we're not going to bother you. So there began this period of ferment in Eastern Europe to go along with the ferment within the Soviet Union itself. And what became apparent was something that a lot of people had known, and even more had suspected, that these communist regimes in Eastern Europe were not popular at all. And given the first opportunity, the people of Eastern Europe would challenge them, indeed throw them over, perhaps. So this whole thing came to a head several months after Reagan left office. Reagan was succeeded by George H.W. Bush. In those days, he was just called George Bush because no one had any idea that his son of the same first name would later become president. So it's George Bush. George Bush is president. George Bush had been vice president to Ronald Reagan. George Bush had a long background as a moderate Republican. Reagan was known as a conservative Republican. Bush was a moderate who was more open to government activities in various areas, less of an overt hawk in foreign policy, and a guy who knew how to get things done. Someone who was less given to theatrical speeches. It wasn't George Bush's style to stand at the Berlin Wall and say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But he was very experienced in foreign policy. And he probably was as experienced in foreign policy as any but maybe 2 or 3 other presidents in American history. George Bush had been America's representative, America's ambassador to the United Nations. This was important. He had gotten to know, and in that position, he had gotten to know many of the diplomats of other countries. He had been an American envoy to China, and so he knew what was going on in China. So he was really well versed, and he basically knew a lot of the people who had been ambassadors back when he was at the United Nations, who now had become prime ministers and premiers and presidents. And he knew them on a first-name basis. This would turn out to be really important. So anyway, Bush is president. He's been president not long, when the ferment within Eastern Europe is starting to come to a head. And the critical point, the critical moment, occurs in Berlin in the autumn of 1989. And on the other side of the wall, from where Reagan had said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, large crowds develop on the East German side. So this is the communist side of the wall. And there were gates in the wall, but the gates had always been closed to East Germans who wanted to go to West Germany, to East Berliners who wanted to go to West Berlin, to East Germans who wanted to go to West Germany. And it had been a rather traumatic thing when the wall went up. It was erected very quickly in 1961, and it meant that there were families who had family members on both sides of the wall who had not been able to see each other face to face, to hug each other. They could communicate by mail or later by telephone, but now they could actually, so what they were demanding, what these East Germans, East Berliners were demanding was the right to go into West Berlin. And whereas Reagan, the American president, had said, tear down this wall, now it's a large crowd of East Berliners and other East Germans who were saying, tear down this wall. And this protest gets louder and louder and bigger. And the East German government has to figure out what to do. And even more to the point, the East German guards, the soldiers who are guarding the wall, have to figure out what to do. Since the wall went up in the early 1960s, there had been shoot-to-kill orders. If anybody even gets close to the wall on the East German side, on the East Berlin side, if anybody tries to climb the wall, shoot them, shoot to kill. And many people had been killed trying to break out of East Berlin. But now the crowd is there, and the crowd doesn't know, so what's the policy? And the crowd is saying, let's open the gates. We want to get into West Berlin. If you are serious about this policy of openness, let's see you put your money where your mouth is. And so they begin pushing toward the gates, and the guards, they're standing there with their weapons, and what do we do? Do we shoot them all? There'd be a bloodbath if they did. And the guards, well, they had their orders, or at least they had these long-standing orders, but they were in no hurry to start shooting unarmed civilians, and they don't want to do it. And so the crowd's moving in, and they're holding their weapons, and what do we do? What do we do? And they're quickly getting on the phone to their superiors. What do we do? What do we do? And the superiors are trying to get to their superiors. What do we do? What do we do? And it was really clear that the East German government had lost the support of the East German people, who were demanding more reform even than the East German government was willing to allow. The East German government was pretty conservative as some of these reform communist governments went. But now faced with this massive demonstration, this turning into a riot, what do we do? And at the critical moment, the East German government said, don't shoot, and said, open the gates. And this was one of those moments in history where you could almost see things changing before your very eyes. Now, to be sure, it was not even 3 decades that the Berlin Wall had been up, but it seemed like a lifetime. And indeed, it was a lifetime. It was the lifetime of many of those protesters. A large portion of the crowd was young people, was students, people who were 18, 20, 22, 3 years old. For their entire lives, there had been this dividing line between East Berlin and West Berlin, between East and West. And now the gate is open. The dividing line has been taken down. Figuratively, the wall has come down. What would that lead to? Well, on that very night when the gates opened, thousands of East Berliners poured into West Berlin. And they could see what they had only been able to see in magazines or on television. And they could walk down the streets and they could cheer and shake hands with the West Berliners. It seemed like a great moment in the history of Berlin, in the history of Germany, maybe even indeed in the history of the world. It looked on that night as though the Cold War was over, because the Cold War had been all about this immutable divide between East and West. And now the divide was gone. Now, in some ways you could say that this was just sort of the logical outcome of Richard Nixon's policy of détente, that we can live and let live. We can get along as normal people. And if indeed the wall had opened, and the gates had opened, the wall had come down, and I say figuratively the wall came down. Physically, the wall came down in relatively short order, because protesters got up on the top with sledgehammers and anything they could take to knock pieces of the wall down. And it wasn't long before the wall itself came down. And the divided city of Berlin was no longer divided. But the question then became, well, what about Germany? What about Eastern Europe and Western Europe? What about the Soviet Union? Now, I'm going to just share a reflection from my own professional experience. I was born before the Berlin Wall went up. I was 8 years old when the Berlin Wall was built, and at 8 years old, I had hardly any understanding of what was going on. I don't remember the first time I ever heard of the Berlin Wall, but it was just something I kind of grew up with. And so I grew up essentially with the Cold War, or let's put it this way, by the time I was old enough to know about the world, the Cold War, this division of the world between the American side and the Soviet side, this seemed to be a permanent part of the reality of international relations. And later I got into this field professionally. So I became a historian, and part of what I studied was American foreign policy. And as someone who started studying American foreign policy in the 1970s and into the 1980s, I absorbed the attitudes of people who had been studying this same subject for longer than I had. And just about everybody assumed that this bipolar arrangement, the Americans and the American alliance system, the Soviets and the Soviet alliance system, were more or less permanent aspects of international affairs, permanent aspects of the world political horizons. And almost nobody, the international relations experts, the theorists, the practitioners, the historians, the political scientists, almost none of them saw coming what in fact very soon did come, namely the end of the Cold War, and not just the end of the Cold War, but the demise of the Soviet Union, that sort of one party to the Cold War would just fall to pieces. And even those people who would entertain the possibility that this would happen, most of them predicted, and I thought about this, and I said, well, okay, so if this ever would happen, the world better watch out, because almost never in human history had a large empire, and the Soviet Union was often aptly described as an empire. In fact, sometimes it was described as the inner empire and the outer empire. The inner empire was Russia, so Russia was really the homeland of the Soviet Union. And the inner empire was the other so-called Soviet socialist republics, the various parts of the Soviet Union that were non-Russian, that were within the Soviet Union. That's why it's called the Union. That was the inner empire. And then the outer empire was the countries of Eastern Europe. And these were the ones that were the buffer states for that the Soviet Union had created around its western boundaries so that Germany, for example, wouldn't be able to invade again. And at times the Soviet Empire, well, it seemed as though it might include China, although China had spun off by the 1960s. But anyway, the Soviet Union was this massive empire geographically, one of the largest in world history. And in terms of military power, it was second only to the United States and its alliance system. I should point out that critics of the United States sometimes called the American system an American empire too. But one of the differences was that, at least until the end, there was no getting out of the Soviet Empire. So Hungary wanted to get out of the Soviet Empire in the 1950s, and the Soviet Red Army, the tanks came rolling in and crushed that reform movement. And Czechoslovakia flirted with the same idea in the 1960s. And again, the tanks rolled and crushed the reformists. So it was pretty clear that once you were in the empire, you didn't get out. In fact, while there were the American doctrines, the Monroe Doctrine and the Carter Doctrine and the other doctrines, there was something that came to be called the Brezhnev Doctrine, named after Leonid Brezhnev. And the Brezhnev Doctrine said, once you're in the Soviet Empire, you don't get out of the Soviet Empire. Now contrast this to the American Empire. The American Empire, it was a formal empire at one time, including the Philippines, but the Philippines became independent in 1946, and so the Philippines wanted out, and they got out. In terms of America's sort of less formal empire, but the American alliance system, it included France from the 1940s and into the 1950s, but in the 1960s, President Charles de Gaulle of France said, France is going to pull out of NATO because NATO infringes on French independence. And there were some people in Washington who said, wait a minute, we can't let the French do this. But Lyndon Johnson, president of the time, said, yeah. In fact, the way he put it was, when a man tells you to leave his house, you don't argue, you just take your hat and go. And so France pulled out of NATO. And so the American empire, such as it was a voluntary empire. You could say, I want out, and you could get out. Anyway, when political scientists and international relations theorists imagined the demise of the Soviet empire, they almost all, and I include myself in this group, they predicted that if this is going to happen, there's going to be a big war, because no empire goes down without a fight. And the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. And so if the East Germans tried to spin away, well, they could be threatened with nukes, maybe small nukes, but nukes nonetheless. If other republics within the Soviet Union, the various Soviet socialist republics, if they wanted out, they could be crushed. Tanks would be sent in. Again, you could use nuclear weapons if necessary. So there might be a civil war in the Soviet Union, and that would not be good, because nobody wanted to see a civil war in a country that had nuclear weapons. There would be strong incentive for the contending parties to try to grab the nukes and maybe use them if necessary. And once the nukes started going off, there would be no telling where it would end. Well, so these were the consensus was basically that this bipolar system is essentially permanent, but if it does break down, there will be hell to pay. Well, when the East Germans demanded that the wall come down, and the wall came down, and the East Germans and the West Germans mingled peacefully, and no tanks rolled, and no machine gun fire sprayed the crowds, the IR theorists and people like me were, what in the world is going on? Then there was a moment when it looked as though the bluff of the United States, a big bluff of the United States in international affairs, was being called. It had been the stated position of the United States and of the rest of the NATO alliance system that the United States was in favor of German reunification. Remember that Germany had been divided at the end of World War II. And the division, which had been intended then as temporary, became permanent over the years because of the Cold War. But it remained stated American policy that at first opportunity, the United States supports the reunification of Germany. But most people in the United States, most of the sort of serious students and practitioners of international relations and foreign policy, said, yeah, that's what we say in public. We don't really want it to happen. Because everybody remembered, or at least had learned, that a unified Germany had caused World War I and then World War II. In fact, there was a whole theory of the world wars of the 20th century that basically said in simplified form that until 1870, Germany was divided into a bunch of different smaller countries and principalities and so on. The Germans get together in the early 1870s, and all of a sudden, they are this great big power, the most powerful country in Europe, and they scare the daylights out of everybody else, and they become aggressive and belligerent, and boom, comes World War I. And at the end of World War I, the mistake at the end of World War I was not breaking up Germany. So Germany remains united, and boom, comes World War II. And then, at the end of World War II, inadvertently, Germany is divided. And ever since Germany has been divided, Europe is at peace. So this was one sort of subset of descriptions of why no World War III, at least as of the end of the 1980s. And so these people said, okay, the Germans are talking about reuniting because they wanted to unite families, they wanted to unite the economy, and they wanted to be able to travel all around Germany. But we sure don't want that to happen because, hey, the last time the Germans were unified, we had 2 world wars in quick succession. And so we don't want to see this happen. So this was the position that was taken by Britain, which had fought against Germany in World War I and World War II. This was the position that was taken by France, which had been overrun, well, half overrun by the Germans in the First World War, basically completely overrun by Germany in the Second World War. And they didn't want to see it happen. We don't want to see a united Germany because there were plenty of people in the 1980s who had fought in World War II. And we don't want to do this again. And the Soviets They didn't want to see a united Germany for exactly the same reasons. They had been invaded by the Germans in World War I and basically had to drop out of the war at Germany's insistence. And they had been invaded and been really manhandled for a long time by the Germans in the first part of World War II. So they didn't want to see a united Germany. The only foreign power, other than the leader of Germany, the Chancellor of West Germany, a man named Helmut Kohl, who was willing to go along with German unification, was George Bush. And George Bush had this idea. George Bush was a veteran of World War II, so it's not as though he didn't have this experience, although maybe it was significant that Bush's World War II was the Pacific War. So he was off there fighting the Japanese, not fighting the Germans. Maybe that had some impact on this. But in any event, Bush took the position that the United States is going to live up to what it says it's going to do since the 1940s. The United States is in favor of German unification. And he pointed out something that other people had been preparing for. By this time, what had begun as the European Common Market and then became the European Community, and it was on its way to becoming the European Union. This was a group that could basically contain Germany. If the Germans had any notion of getting out of hand, they would be so closely tied into the EU, the European Union, that it would basically dissipate those expansionist tendencies of the Germans. Furthermore, this unified Germany would be part of NATO, and the United States would be overseeing Germany within NATO. So Bush sent out the signal that, look, a unified Germany is not going to be a big problem. There are bigger things in the world than Germany. There's the United States, there's NATO, there's the EU. And Bush, working with Helmut Kohl, pushed German unification through. And this was really a big deal. Oh, there's one other thing about it, and that was, although East Germany was the most prosperous of the Eastern European satellites of the Soviet Union, it turned out that East Germany was really impoverished by comparison with West Germany. And people started looking at how this unification would take place, realized that maybe one day in the distant future, Germany, a united Germany, is going to be able to afford an ambitious foreign policy, but it's going to be a long ways down the road because West Germany is going to be subsidizing and rebuilding East Germany for a generation at least. They'll have their hands full just dealing with unification. So unification of Germany went through, and in one respect, in some minds, that marked the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War really had begun between the United States and the Soviet Union over differences about Germany, over a failure to come up with a lasting solution to the question of where does Germany fit in the post-war world. So now there is a united Germany. This takes place in the autumn of 1990. There is this united Germany, and united Germany has its place in NATO, has its place in Europe and in the European Union. And so there it is. And if nothing more had happened, that might have augured the end of the Cold War. Maybe on the principles of détente. There still would have been a government in the Soviet Union, and it was perhaps a less socialist government than it had been before because Gorbachev's reforms keep gaining pace. But something then happened that nobody expected, and that was the Soviet Union itself fell apart. There were conservatives in the Soviet Union, including some military men, who resented what Gorbachev had done. He had let the Eastern European countries spin out of control. The other Eastern European countries followed the example of the Germans and overthrew their communist governments and established reform governments. So the Soviet Union no longer had this buffer system on its west side. And it looked as though the Soviet Union was just shrinking down into a shadow of its former self. And some of these hardliners, these unreconstructed old communists, they wanted to undo this. So they staged a coup against Gorbachev. The coup failed, though, and they were discredited. But Gorbachev himself was shown as weak. And the whole idea of the Soviet Union suddenly came to seem anachronistic. The outer empire had spun away. Now the various parts of the inner empire say, we want out of this too. And in fact, at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union held a final meeting of all of these groups, and they basically said, okay, we're going out of business. And the Soviet Union simply dissolved. And in its place emerged all these new countries. Russia was the biggest, but other countries, Ukraine and Belarus and the various Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and so on, they emerged as these independent countries. So this dissolution of the Soviet Union, this finally is the end of the Cold War. And the end of the Cold War, well, it was something that Americans had been working for a long time. What the consequences of the end of the Cold War were remain to be seen.